Welcome, guys. Welcome to Conspirinormal. I'm here. This is Adam, all by my lonesome. But never fear, because we've got someone here with us tonight, and we're going to talk about an interesting subject. But this person that I have with me, Heather,
Hi.
is a really good friend, and
Oh,
she has not been on Conspirinormal for a good minute. It's been a while, and Heather is probably like the first ever fan of Conspirinormal because she and I used to work together way back in the day. And whenever I started this way back in 2012, I she was one of the first. She was the first person to ever really listen.
well,
So
me and Joe and I guess it was me and Joe. Yeah, so we're battling it out for top fan for oldest fan.
yeah, something like that. Something like that. But we're going to talk about a subject tonight, one that I'm really excited about digging into. And this is a book that Heather, you and I were at Aroma G's here in Nashville. And I'm not ashamed to give them any kind of a plug.
No, they're
But
great.
yeah. Um, and I found a book. You you found a book called When God Was a Woman. I'll hold it up for nobody but you. Um, that's by an author named Merlin Stone. And this is a book about, well, called The Landmark Exploration of the Ancient Worship of the Great Goddess and the Eventual Suppression of Women's Rights. And rights is spelled Rites.
Hmm.
So I read this book back when after I had a break after Strange Realities conference, and it's a very good book. And I know this is one that you read as well. And I was thinking about having who could have, of course, can't talk to Merlin Stone because Merlin Stone passed away in 2011. I found out, and so I thought that we get you on. We talk about this. And there was a
Well,
couple
thanks.
of documentaries, one of which actually had Merlin Stone in it
Hmm.
that we watched, but we'll talk about that too. So I guess the first question is this book was published in believe in 1976,
Hmm.
and just kind of just talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of like the context that this book came out in,
All right,
and
sounds
maybe you
good.
can explain for the listeners that don't know about the second wave of feminism. I think is when this was the part of the era this was part of, if I'm correct
Correct.
about that.
Yes, I mean, I'm not a well, I consider myself a feminist. I'm not an expert on all the historical timeline of feminism, but yeah, this would be considered, I think, a second wave feminism book. First wave, of course, being the women's suffrage movement, to get the vote. Um, but that only really affected white women, and it only really got them the vote and a couple of other like minor um, rights. But it wasn't until like the 60s, like the 1960s, around that time period when second wave feminism arose. Um, this was during the civil rights movement. There was a little bit more um, bringing in women of color and trying to address their needs, but it still was not where it needed to be. It's not until like third wave feminism during the 90s that you see any real attention and real traction made for intersectionality, which is a term actually that was coined by, oh Lord, forgive me, I cannot remember her name, but it means how like different um, socioeconomic, racial, age, a lot of things play into how you're treated, and so feminism as or like sexism. I mean, sexism against someone who is a white woman will look a whole lot different from someone who is, say, a black woman or an Asian woman or a Native American woman. So therefore, when we're talking about feminism, it's important to keep all of these things in mind, so we can really address larger issues and not just make white women's lives easier. So we are now living in what would be considered fourth wave feminism, which started around like the late 90s, early 2000s, and is still going on. Though some say that we should now be moving into a fifth wave feminism. I don't know anything about that, so I'm not even going to try to talk to that.
Gotcha.
Other people could probably tell you about that better, but it's my understanding we're still in fourth wave feminism, which is the hallmarks of that are like grassroots kind of movements through internet, social media, like the Me Too movement, like the hashtag Me Too, that kind of stuff, and is more focused on kind of broadening that intersectionality to include like LGBTQ plus, as also, and obviously as a part of that trans feminism. This is where you might stumble upon terms like TERFs, which is trans exclusionary radical feminism, which is those TERFs are people who would say, I'm a feminist, and trans people have, or like a trans woman is not a woman, which BT dubs. I'm not a TERF. So if you say you're a woman, if you think you're a woman, then I believe you're a woman. That's how I roll. So those are kinds of issues that would come up during like fourth wave feminism. But this book was written during like the second wave feminism era. So the documentary that you spoke of, you can kind of see it is mostly white women's voices. It is mostly European centric, mostly Western cultures that it's dealing with, which is not at all like the book. The book, When God Was a Woman, Merlin Stone does a very good job of covering several different types of cultures from all over the globe, and really hitting on a variety of gods and goddesses in her work. The documentary you spoke of, what is it? Not Recovering the Goddess. What was the name of that documentary?
Goddess Remembered.
Goddess Remembered. Yeah. Like it has Merlin Stone in it. And Barbara Ehrenreich too, I think. But like, no, it does not do a good job of representing several different cultures. So one wonders how much actual control Merlin Stone had over, the production of that documentary. So, but in any event, that is a very short and dirty history of different waves of feminism. Somebody else could probably tell it a whole lot better than I can, but that's the short version.
Yeah, it seemed like the documentary, and I mean we can go more into this if you want. I think I found that by typing in Merlin Stone and trying to see if there was anything or any interviews with her or what whenever I was reading the book. It was
real quick. Kimberly Crenshaw.
Okay,
that is the woman who termed who came up with the term intersectionality.
Gotcha.
It was bugging me, so I looked it up. Anyway, go ahead.
Gotcha. I actually ran across some of that today, just kind of looking into this and these terms that you were talking about. But the documentary, I mean, it's kind of dated, I would say, because I think it was probably made in the late 80s, maybe even the really early 90s.
Yeah, and the second part came out in 1990, so I don't know when the other parts came out.
Yeah,
but I know that one.
Yeah, the second part was called The Burning Time, which was about the witchcraft and the witch hunts, and we could talk a little bit about that too. But
if we have to,
if we have to, we'll get your opinionated opinion.
I'm always willing to give my opinion, Adam.
I understand but the documentary was a little frustrating in kind of the way that it was structured, because you know, I was trying to figure out who was Merlin Stone, and there's at a certain point where she is talking about it, and you figure out, okay, well, you know, she's describing the book, but they don't tell
Mhm.
you who any of these people are that are sitting around this table and talking to each other until the very end of the documentary, and then it's and only then do you know. So, you know, it's kind of it's a little dated, I think, like you said, but and I don't think it went as in depth
No, not at
as the
all.
book definitely does. So I thought I thought I was kind of expecting it to be more of a documentary about the book,
Mm-mm. It
but
did
it
not
really
seem to be.
wasn't. Yeah. This was something that was made, I think, by the National Film Board of Canada, and I think it's like a three part series that was made in the
Yeah.
late
Like
80s,
the
early
music is
90s.
really hokey and the narration is super hokey. It's got this really breathy woman narrating. Um,
Yes. Yeah, it
like,
does.
so the documentary, I got the feeling from it that it was the audience that they were intending that for was for like tired moms watching PBS, is
Mm-hmm.
kind of the feeling I got. Um, what would now appear on the History Channel. Um, Not to diss the History Channel too much. I enjoy it just as much as the next person. But
When it's not Ancient Aliens.
when is it not Ancient Aliens?
That's true.
Oh, it's not Ancient Aliens when it's about World War II.
It used to be the Hitler channel. Now it's
It used to be the Hitler Channel.
The Ancient
Yeah.
Aliens channel. Yeah.
So a lot of like research tends to kind of trickle down into these kind of documentaries, where it's meant for bite-sized pieces for people to just kind of like whet their appetite, I guess. And this would definitely fall under that, in my opinion. It's so far removed from the actual scholarship of Merlin Stone's book that I wouldn't even
Mm-hmm.
consider them related personally.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, what did you think about the second documentary, the burning time?
Oh, okay.
We're kind of going far
So,
afield here, but that's fine.
so the Burning Times is in reference to the witch trials. Now they seem to focus more on the European versus the continental, versus like the not the American witch trials, like Salem witch trials, but like the European
Yeah,
witch trial,
right.
which spanned a much larger time period and much earlier. Like by the time America was hitting on the Salem witch trials, like Europe had already figured that shit out. I mean, excuse me, that stuff out, and they weren't into that anymore. Like they were kind of like petered out. They finally finished. Like I guess we killed enough women now. Like I guess we're done. Um, so you don't see like Cotton Mather or not Cotton, Increase Mather and that team really on the scene until after Europe kind of finished that up like 50 years prior. And the witch trials in Europe lasted from like I want to say 1600s to 1700s, maybe longer. Was it longer? I think it was like 200 years. So it was like
It
1500.
was something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but they had finished up. Um, and then 50 years later, the American ones kind of started up and really hit the scene. Now, it's important to note that historically, the witch trials were a political tool. But the documentary is really focusing on this theory that it was a tool to exterminate a large portion of women. So, while I think that's a fine theory to start from if you don't know a lot about the history of the witch trials, any real digging into the records, I think would show that, like the scholarship now shows that it wasn't specifically just to kill women or to kill women who happened to be practicing medicine. Like the book by Barbara Ehrenreich and I forget the other author. They wrote like Witches, Nurses, and Midwives, which is an excellent read. It's very quick. You could read it in like an afternoon.
Mm-hmm.
They go into this a little bit, but it was more focused on the American witch trials. But it also kind of pulls on that same kind of thread where the witch trials were a way to get rid of women medical practitioners. But scholarship now shows that that's not really the case. At least in the case of America, is like a lot of those witch trials were to gain the land these people were living on, and it wasn't all women.
Right.
It's a lot of them were
Right.
men. They were trying, the people in power in townships and stuff were just trying to get a hold of this property, because once the person is proven to be a witch, their land is up for grabs. So the court would then seize it. So in Europe, the witch trials were more about, at least in the beginning, it was used as a tool to oust people from power. You could just claim that they were a witch. And the torture element of it didn't come until later. That, the whole Inquisition angle. And then, especially by the time the witch's hammer gets written, which I can never remember the Latin for that. Please forgive me. It's like Maleficum, Malleus Maleficum.
Malleus Maleficarum.
Okay, I was close.
Yeah.
But yeah, when witch's hammer comes out, like it's a real big deal. You have all these people all across Europe, places like you got these people out in Germany getting the same kind of answers from women under, torture, questioning, that are giving the same kind of answers as the women who are being tortured for answers out in France. How can that be? Why would they be giving the same kinds of answers? Well, that's because the people who were doing the torturing were all using the same book. They were all using the same guidebook on how to question these people, these women and men who were being accused of witchcraft. So the Killing Times documentary, it seems to be really just focused on talking about what that was like, some of the writings that were coming out during that time period, but it also is making a point to draw a direct line from, this is a really horrible historical thing that happened, and it was because the church was trying to kill off people who worshipped the old gods and the old ways, when scholarship doesn't really show that to be true as a conclusion, at least in my opinion, and most scholars' opinion, I think, at this point in time.
Okay. Yeah. It was interesting. They did bring in some of the property stuff into that, but
yeah, they did touch on it.
It was very much focused on the idea that, you're killing the folk practitioners, which were mostly women.
Yeah.
But then also it was kind of like, they said, I don't know how true this is, that this was really like kind of the end of the folk ways, and that had to go more underground. And I don't know about that. I feel like that would have happened much earlier than those 2 centuries.
You think about the Inquisition, right? You think about the Inquisition that was going on.
Yeah.
It's not a wild supposition to say, hey, if I'm over here talking about some sort of like fae folk and wild magic and like old gods and goddesses, I might get unalived by the church. That's hard of a leap. Like that makes sense. Like it would make sense that then these old folk practices would go out of use, or at least go underground, or be relabeled as Christian practices, because you don't want to get killed by the Inquisition. Like that makes perfect sense. But I don't know that was the reasoning behind, the Inquisition and the witch killings. Like I don't know that that's necessarily why those things took place by those who orchestrated them. I think it was power run amok.
Yeah, I'd say very much so. Well, let's get into this book, When God Was a Woman.
Let's do it.
So, all right. So we'll start kind of how she starts, Merlin Stone, and she talks about the idea that in ancient times, and we're really talking about prehistory, that there was this really ancient, really kind of primeval, really goddess religion, and that there was much more of these societies saw much more of an importance towards women, and that there really, in a lot of ways, seemed to be an equalization of the burden of life between men and women.
Yeah, I mean, that's not hard to like really imagine, even if you don't see all this great archaeological evidence that Merlin Stone shows, right? Like, if you think about it, you're in prehistory, right? You don't understand a thing about how biology works, but you do see that women bleed and make babies. And you, in those times, they didn't necessarily have a concept for, oh, babies also come from a man and his member and his sperm. Like, because they hadn't made that connection yet entirely. You have the woman figure who makes humans, and humans come from women, period, end of statement. So the idea of a divine figure from which all things come, it would make sense that it would be a female deity. And like Merlin Stone lays out all this really great archaeological evidence that she found through scholarly work, that shows that many cultures, in fact, had a female deity as not only a very important deity, but usually the most important deity in their pantheon. It wasn't until later that once people started making a connection of, oh, the baby only happens if we do the whoopsie. So once that connection is made, things start to change a little bit. Of course, Merlin lays out that it's seems to coincide more with like the female deity becomes replaced when, you know, these invading people from like north of the Caucasus Mountains start coming, like the Indo-Europeans start coming down into these regions with their male god. And of course, I don't know how soon you want to get into that. We can jump right into it right away, or you want to talk some more about this female deity.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about this the concept of the mother goddess and this type of thing. And I mean, you've got a lot of she has some pictures in the book, but of course, you know, some of the most famous, you know, like was it the Venuses, they're called Venuses, but you know, they're
Right.
these ancient figurines that, you know, was it the Venus of Willendorf. That's probably the most famous one that people usually see, and you'll see amulets and stuff like that. That is around. So like this concept of the mother goddess, and you did make the connection to fertility.
Yeah.
And there's also like, you know, these like, and they said in that one in that first documentary, and I've seen this before too, like these caves that are like have the kind of the shape to them, the entrance to the caves. That's something that is that something that is generally accepted, or is that more, do they think that has something to do with the goddess?
So yeah, I see a lot of writing about that. I mean, you've got the Mother Earth kind of idea. Also important to note, a lot of these female deities were also associated with mountains. So you have the cave network underneath the mountains. I mean, you think about it, you're a prehistoric person. The best shelter you've got is probably a cave. But then, of course, you also have the idea of like a cave, a big, dark, possibly damp opening within the earth from which you can go into it for safety and then emerge back out into the world. I mean, it's symbolism for like birth. So caves were definitely associated with the goddess. That, you know, oh man, there's this whole section that Merlin goes into about like the Oracle of Delphi too, where it's talking about how like you've got like the imagery of going down into the underworld and the snakes. Snakes live in the underground as well as the top side, and there's a lot of oracles, or not just like Greek oracles, but there were a lot of cultures that worshipped this goddess figure in connection with snakes, that also became, they would go to them for advice, or not fortune telling, but like for to augur the stars and to know where to go and what to do. And in fact, the Oracle of Delphi, if I'm not mistaken, also had a history of having like these noxious gases that would come out that make you kind of loopy.
Yeah.
So there's that. Which I don't want to get ahead of myself, but remind me of that when we get back into the discussion of like Astarta and the replacement with
Yeah.
Elohim.
Yeah. We're
But yeah, I
getting
want to get
there.
into
Yeah.
that too. There.
Yeah. We're definitely getting there, because I think that's pretty much the crux of the book, really.
Yes.
A
Yes.
lot of it is that in the first few chapters is her just kind of laying the historical background and the idea that, that the goddess in at least prehistory was worshipped more widely. It seems would have been more worshipped more widely um than in later times, later
Oh,
ancient world.
and also the goddess was in many cases worshipped as the sun goddess. And it
Right.
wasn't until
Mm-hmm.
later that she was replaced and, like, I guess demoted as as a lesser goddess, either the earth or the moon or something like that. And then a male deity was placed as the sun godhead.
Right. Yeah.
Um, which I thought was incredibly interesting. I'd never heard that before, but then she lays out all this evidence. Like the first third to almost half of this book is just, I gotta be honest with you, it was a slog. It was hard to get
Yeah.
through
Yeah.
because
It
it's just
can.
a whole
Yeah.
bunch of records and maps, and like it doesn't make a lot of conclusions. It's just the first large chunk of this book is just slogging through the facts, which I appreciate, but it's a very dry read.
Yeah. And we get to like Sumeria, so we get to the first, the first ancient culture,
Mm-hmm.
the first ancient historical culture, which would be Sumeria, essentially. Sumeria and Egypt are kind of around the same time, but Sumeria is generally considered to be first. And then you've got there much more goddess oriented worship. Like I think Inanna
Mm-hmm.
is one of the goddesses that is worshipped
Mm-hmm.
there. There is a pantheon, so you do see male gods, male deities in
Right, they're like
these
consorts though,
pantheons.
usually,
Right.
right?
That's is what she says. Yeah.
They're like consorts or her child, or sometimes both.
Uh-huh. Right.
Which, it's a lot of gods and goddesses in ancient worships had a lot of weird, like, you're my son, also you're my lover, like it's weird
Mm-hmm.
that,
Mm-hmm.
So there was a lot of that, but it's interesting how a lot of those different cultures had very similar stories, just with different gods' names, and a lot of them kind of sound similar. So you do see how the different cultures probably shared some ideas about, oh, your god, your goddess takes the moon as the lover, and then they um, shoot out a baby. Oh, well, my goddess takes the moon as a lover and then comes down to earth to have a party. But yeah, that sounds cool. I think I'm going to change my story to sound like yours. Like I think there was probably a lot of that kind of, what's that called, synchronization kind of going on,
Right.
where
Right.
cultures were overlapping through trade routes and just migration, and they probably shared a lot of things like that. So you end up with some cultures where their gods and goddesses all have very similar sounding names with lots of the same elements.
Yeah, like I think you talk about for example, in Egyptian mythology, I mean, you have Isis,
Mm-hmm.
and she is the wife, but also kind of I guess her and Osiris are equal to each other.
Yeah, I
But
think, am I not mistaken? Aren't they brother and sister?
I think they
Also,
are. Yeah, they
yeah.
are. Yeah, they are. And then she, the whole thing with him getting dismembered and
Mm-hmm.
that whole thing. And then she has Horus, who is the son. So you've got, you've got her consort and then the son. So that's I think a good example of what you're talking about with
Mm-hmm.
like this kind of like ancient Near Eastern mythologies.
Mm-hmm.
We should add in something in here too. So we're talking about the ancient Near East, is kind of about the there's an interesting chapter, the sacred sexual customs. That's a chapter
Right.
that she has in here,
Yeah.
and I think that this is kind of important to understand how some of these cultures, well, first of all, how they viewed the goddess, but second of all, how they also viewed sex as like almost like a religious rite in and of itself.
Yeah. So like the um the sexual rites of the temple. So there's some I thought that was interesting how in the Bible these these women who were the priestesses kind of got translated into whores, like biblical. I mean, like temple prostitutes, and the sexual acts that they would do there were seen as a kind of dirty thing when it may not even been at all that they were engaging in sexual acts explicitly, or it may have been done as a kind of worship. Also, I thought was very interesting and is that Merlin talks about how in older archaeologists' writings, when they would talk about the discovery of certain things, they would always refer to like male centric worshiping systems as religions, but women centric worshiping systems as cults.
Mm-hmm.
That was very
Mm-hmm.
interesting. And I've never noticed that before, but it is very common. And I think it's still usually in scholarly works, you still kind of see that today.
Yeah, I suppose that is true. Yeah, that is an interesting concept. Well, these were like I mean, the idea that like this was called, they were called temple prostitutes,
Mm-hmm.
but that prostitution, the label prostitution may be something that is pejorative and that was put onto these women by later
Yes.
authors.
Yeah. They may not have even been understood in that same kind of context by the people at
Yeah.
those times. I mean, probably not. Um, certainly with our connotations of prostitution, which I mean, I'm very pro sex work positive, but I know a lot of people are not. And in vast majority of media, it is not. It is meant as a derogatory term. Yeah.
Uh, so let's talk. So just to make that point, we'll get to some of the reasons of why that is here in a little bit. But just to kind of talk about the Indo-European immigration, which does she explicitly call them Indo-Europeans, or does it more that she says like these are like invaders from the north? Because I felt like when I was reading it, she doesn't really mention. I don't know if she mentions that word, but she says that where
I
they
mean, she
came
has
from, and
maps,
and
right?
you make
She has maps.
yeah yeah
And I
maps
don't
are
think
always
she ever
helpful.
usually, yeah, I don't think she actually calls them Indo-Europeans. She talks about where they probably came from, but also remember, um, it came in waves. It wasn't just like one single event. This happened over like 1,000 to 3,000 years of just wave after wave of different peoples coming from this basic area
Right.
down into the south from across the Caucasus Mountains and things like that. So it wasn't just one group of people who are like, all right, well, let's get our chariots ready. We're going to go invade the South and, with our big penis god. So let's go. And that's not what it was like. It was definitely a um, over very long period of time. And so
Yeah.
that's probably also why you have how those different groups kind of went into different areas. Also, remember, this is about the time of the Bronze Age collapse. So it was chaos The Bronze Age collapse probably also really helped destabilize everything, that made it easier for these people, for these different peoples to come from other areas. I mean, you had people moving all over the place during the Bronze Age collapse, right? So it was probably a whole lot easier to topple governments and countries and take over the place.
Yeah, there was a couple of groups, I think, of Indo-Europeans of the ancient world. I mean, the Hittites was probably like the main one. They were considered to be Indo-Europeans.
Yeah.
And they were a little bit before the Bronze Age collapse, but there was another one, I think the Kassites. I think they were a Indo-European group that was actually took over Babylon at one point.
Mm-hmm.
But she makes the point that these all these different groups, they bring more of the idea of the male deity, at
Yeah.
least as far as we're talking about like the ancient Near East.
Right. So the male deity. So Merlin Stone's book, When God Was a Woman, is not the only place I've heard this theory, which
Right.
lends it more credence to me, because as that work has aged, more work has come out in support of this supposition that the God that we know of as Yahweh actually came from these groups and supplanted a lot of the goddess worship that we know from archaeological evidence, and probably came from these Indo-European groups. And that's it was, Yahweh was this sky god, and in some places it kind of like syncretized with like this volcano god, because like the storms that would arise and erupt from the tops of volcanoes when a big eruption happens, like oftentimes the electrical conductivity of the cloud creates like storms and stuff. Anyway, that's another theory I'd heard. I don't think that's in Merlin Stone's book, but like the volcano storm god kind of gets syncretized with the Yahweh storm god. Anyway, so this god who rides the clouds, they bring that with them as they kind of conquer more southern areas. Yahweh, from what we can tell from these earlier beliefs about Yahweh before he makes his big debut in the Bible, he was very much a conquering God. He was very warlike. Oh, totally side, I'm branching off here for a second, but
That's
I also
totally fine.
that reminds me, that was another thing that really irked me about the documentary, because some of these documentaries failed to mention that some of these goddesses were also goddesses of war.
That's true. Yeah.
Tried to make it out like, oh, the goddess is so, and I'm trying to do the impression of the woman narrating, and I'm being totally rude about it. It really, I hated it. But oh, the goddess was a flowery fertility goddess, and she was peaceful, and everyone who believed and worshipped her was living in a utopia with unicorns and rainbows, and everyone sang kumbaya and loved everyone else and braided each other's hair. And like, that's not at all what all the goddess figures were like. And to try to paint it as that, I think, does a disservice.
Yeah, I mean, how do you explain something like Kali? I mean, that's right. I mean, they must not have seen Temple of Doom. I mean,
Right. So that was just I had to throw that in there because it made me think of that. But yeah, so Yahweh was this conquering, warlike God who rode the clouds and had his thunderbolts and spoke from clouds and from the tops of mountains. And here he and his people come down to pick up this power vacuum that had started to come about in the Near East and the Arabic, what we now know as Arabic cultures, and like Anatolia, which is now Turkey. So all these areas were invaded. Or maybe they just migrated there peacefully, but probably not. I mean, their god was a war god, and they came with their much better technology of, the double-headed axe and horse and carriage, like chariots and wagons and stuff. Like they had a much better war technology than a lot of the people they were conquering. So it was very easy for them to come in and take over the place.
Yeah,
with their penis.
With their penis god. That's a good way to put it. Yeah, so I mean, we're talking about things like gods like Indra and Mithras, and later on, even for the Greeks, like Zeus. I mean, Zeus would be kind of a later, their later version for the Greeks, but the Greeks were Indo-European. But this is the movement into India. I mean, you're right. I mean, it was mostly a warlike culture.
Oh yeah. Oh man, and in India. Okay, so like, oh man, and I don't know enough about like Indian history and religions. But the thing that I remembered from the book was how it was talking about how a lot of the words that we know today for the different deities and demons and things like that mean things like light skinned and dark skinned, and like at their core, which I thought was incredibly telling, because the people that were invading from the northern areas were lighter skinned, and they took over and set up this caste system. And
right,
behold, the demons were all dark skinned people. Gosh, it's almost like the worst parts of the world are because of racism, but what do I know?
Yeah, one group imposing onto another. Yeah, that's definitely what was going on. So really, I want to say to like, there's a process that she's talking about in this book. So we start with the mother goddess, that overarching goddess religion of prehistory, and we move into the ancient world, and we move into agriculture, rise of cities, civilizations. We still have the goddess in a very, very prominent role. And the goddess, if there is a god with her, he is usually a consort to the goddess, not the other way around. She makes that point kind of repeatedly, and this is in Sumeria and somewhat in Egypt and in these areas. And then there you had this northern invasion, the Indo-Europeans, however long this process took. You've got this real kind of like equalization between the god and the goddesses, and they're like on an equal footing to each other. So it's like this is a process that is happening over thousands of years. And then she describes the process where the god becomes superior to the goddess.
Yeah. So after this process really starts taking hold, you see cultural subversion of the goddess figure as now she's the consort to the male deity, right? She is often sometimes replaced as the sun deity by this male figure. And if she's even honored at all in some of these cultures and some of these religious experiences and systems, she is actually killed by the male deity. And you can see vestiges of that in all sorts of different mythologies and religious systems. The Tiamat being slain, the Leviathan being slain. I'm at a loss here, but Merlin Stone lists like probably 20 of these, right? So those figures, if they are still given a place of worship, they are kind of a diminutive to the male. But in many cases, they were just outright murdered in the new religions.
Yeah, but there's still a place for them, I think, is what she's saying, that there's still a place for the goddess religion. It wasn't completely done away with at all. It was just in its it was a kind of its separate world Maybe like the
Mm-hmm.
men have their gods and the women have their goddesses, that's kind of,
Right.
it didn't represent it. There was a bifurcation that didn't it represent all humans at the same time.
Right.
Is that
I
a right
mean,
assessment?
yeah. I mean, and the Indo-Europeans weren't the only ones to have a hard time converting people to their male deity, but then just saying, okay, well, you're really into this deity that you've been worshiping for forever, so I guess you can keep it. We're just gonna change it a little bit for you. Like
Yeah.
that's happened more
Mhm.
than once.
Right. That's true. That's a good point. So then we get to the ancient Israelite religion.
Mm,
And this I really I think is the crux of the book. And I think this is really why she titled it When God Was a Woman.
right.
Because what she's really talking about is specifically more the ancient Israelite religion and how it really, in a lot of ways, starts off not just with God, but there is a goddess there as well.
Yes. This was chapter 5, I think it was. But yeah, this was the really the meatiest part of the book for me, where I really had to reread passages several times, lots of highlighted sections. It's it's important to remember that Israel was first a social group, not an ethnic group. And what we think of as the tribes of Israel um, were not necessarily bound by blood, but were rather picked up as they nomadically traveled or as they, conquered different areas and maybe some people decided to join, hey, I don't mind that you want to chop off a bit of my penis. I'll join up to this club. Sure, why not? So, like, you would have these different groups that would join and would be kind of grouped under one of the already existing tribes, or would, a new tribe would be formed. And what we now know as, the tribes of Israel weren't necessarily like, oh, the 12 brothers and they each had their families. It wasn't just their families, it was other groups of people who joined the collective as well. So one of those groups, which I thought was interesting, was the Merlin makes a case that what we know as the Levites, or the tribe of Levi, some of them were the priest class from some of these different Indo-European communities that came down, namely I think she said it's called the Luvians or the Luvites, and she
Right.
makes a very strong argument, though I haven't heard it anywhere else or any other supporting scholarship. So take that for what it is. But it's a very compelling argument that these Luvians, these Luvites, were in fact the priestly caste, the priestly group, the Levites. And they are the ones who made a lot of these rules about, oh, we can't have this goddess figure here anymore. We don't like this. We like our God. Which, by the way, there's a podcast, or not a podcast, a YouTube channel called Esoterica, and the guy who runs that channel does
Yeah.
an excellent job of breaking down the history of Yahweh, and how Yahweh and El kind of like mixed to become the same God. I thought it was an excellent breakdown of that. It's like a 20-minute video. It's very good. Props to that. But yeah, so like you would have these this priest class come in, and they don't work, and they eat stuff that gets donated to the temple, and they need stuff to be donated to their particular temple, and they can't have stuff being donated to the goddess over there. They need stuff for themselves, and they also need to control. They also need power, and so it's when this particular group comes on the scene that you see a lot of the codification of how El, or Yahweh, should be worshipped, and how God's wife, or the female deity, should not be worshipped anymore. And let's see, Asherah, I think, was the most common version of her name at the time, if I'm not mistaken. Was it Asherah?
Yeah, sometimes it's, I think, translated as Astaroth, I think. But
I think that has to do with and I don't know Hebrew, so I'm just going off my memory here, but I think that was because her name was changed to add a suffix that meant shame or
okay.
something like
Yeah.
that. But yeah, so like the Asherah was a term that was both for the goddess and for the tree pole worship item that was used to worship her in her temple. So you have, you have there was a tree that was kept at the altar of her temples that was communally shared. There was usually like fruit on it. You have this group who want to reinforce their religious claims. So they kind of rewrote religious histories where the female deity was either outright conquered or, in the case of Israel, wrote her as being a figure made out of man instead of woman being the creator deity. Now woman is an afterthought made from the rib of a man. And you can't trust her either. So instead of people who would be going to these temples to be getting oracular wisdom from the priestesses of Asherah, now you can't trust Asherah and her snakes and her tree, because remember, Eve tried to share some fruit from her tree, and by golly, that's how we had the fall. So you can't go trust in those women. You can't go trust in her tree or her fruit. So the oracular snakes became a symbol of bad advice. It's in a world where female deities were asked for advice. Usually, this is a crucial way to eradicate her worship. And I feel like that was the strongest argument that whole buildup that Merlin did to explaining all these different cultures and their goddesses and their hallmarks of worship, and to kind of like boil it down in chapter 5 to, well, here's what happened when these people in power got a hold of worship with their god. And I'm kind of like rambling at this point, but like, God, when you really think about the way history has changed, the way, and I know we've fourth wave feminism, here we are in 2023. I've got it pretty darn good. But we still have women in this country, at least 1 in 4 of them are sexually assaulted in their lifetime. And it's hard to not look back at the way women have been treated historically since those early days. And I don't know what it was like. It may have been all rainbows and unicorns like that documentary would have us believe. I probably not, but we went from goddess worship to 1 in 4. That's where we went. I have a lot of feels about it.
Yeah, it's everything. All that stuff is still a very serious problem.
Yeah,
and it is based in. I mean, it really is based in the whole idea of like of kind of patriarchy, really, which is based in all this.
I mean, I grew up in the church.
Yeah.
And I have amazing parents who even though they put me in Christian schools and they took me to church and we did the Sundays and the Sunday nights and the Wednesday nights and the choir practice and, vacation Bible school and all that. And I'm glad that I had a lot of those experiences. But they were very progressive. They were very much like, look, you're going to hear some things at church. But just know that that's not the only way to view God. And my parents were both very good about giving me a safe place to question things.
Right.
But I will also tell you that I spent a lot of my time in those places, not at home with my very loving progressive Christian parents, but with the very fundamentalist Christians that I was going to school with and going to church with and vacation Bible school with. My parents weren't the ones who were teaching those classes, but fundamentalist people were. And I grew up believing that God was this very angry man who lived in the sky, who had a clipboard, and he was just checking off everything that I was doing wrong. And women were not to be trusted. You know, suffer not a woman to speak. And women can't be pastors. And, you know, it was a very interesting experience. And to be taught that women were the ones who were tempted by the way. So, you know, we are supposed to be the helpmates for Adam. We as women should be the helpers. And there's an umbrella. You know, it's God, and then underneath God is Jesus, and underneath Jesus is the husband, and then underneath the husband is the wife. And you can't question the husband, and you must always do what the husband says, and that's a whole bunch of bullshit. And that was being taught when I was in school. Not at all of my schools, but some of them.
I want to explore just a little bit of this, and not necessarily from the book, but it's interesting because did you hear, I mean, I think you heard my interview with Gary Stevens, who did the History in the Bible podcast. And he actually, you know, I mean, he actually talked a little bit about this somewhat, the idea, not necessarily the idea of the goddess really, but he hit on some of like the development of where scholars are now, of where they think the ancient Israelite religion really kind of came from. And, you know, what is general belief now is that instead of being against the Canaanites, they were the Canaanites, and you had this kind of mythical kingdom of David and Solomon, which I don't know if I necessarily agree with, but the historical record goes to the point where, okay, we know for sure that there was a kingdom of Israel, there was a kingdom of Judah.
Right.
And it seemed like the kingdom of Israel was much more worshipped this kind of like dual kind of God, the God and the goddess. And you can kind of glean that from Chronicles and Kings and about Ahab and Jezebel and all these biblical stories.
Right.
And then you have the destruction of Israel, and there's a more kind of much more monotheist group that escapes there, goes to Judah, and begins to kind of purge Judah of all these type of things. But even remember in the Bible, there would be these kings that they found favor with God, and then they would die, and their son would literally turn back to the old worship. He'd go worship Baal, he'd go worship Astaroth, which is kind of what we're talking about. And then under Josiah, lo and behold, they find the book of Deuteronomy.
Look
coincidentally,
what we found in this wall that we were tearing down.
and then it really becomes really codified.
Right.
But then you have the interruption of the Babylonian captivity. And then really when they get back, that's when what we know as Judaism really begins. And of course, that's the basis for Christianity. Right. It's the basis for Islam. It's basically the basis of Western and Eastern monotheistic religion. Right. So, you know, that's just kind of like, that's how, as I understood it from where he is, from what he's observed and some of the scholars that he's read about that he's put into his podcast. So shout out to Gary for doing some excellent work.
Excellent work. But yeah, that was a good one.
Yeah. And I hope, you know, go back and listen to that, guys. That's a very good podcast. You will learn a lot. But
it reminds me a lot of now, and I mentioned this to you when we were talking before. I have not read this book, but I did listen to an interview about it, and it seems to get into a lot of this. It's called When God Had a Wife,
Right.
which is by Lynn Picknett and
Yeah.
Clive Prince.
Yeah.
That one's
Yeah.
very
Hmm.
good. From the interview that I heard with the authors,
Yeah. I think
it
I
gets
have
into a
that.
lot
I
of
think
this.
I have that book, or I think I have a book. No, no, I don't have that book. I had to think about it, but I have like a couple of their books. I didn't know if I had that one or not. I think that's
Wait,
more of a recent one.
totally off topic. Is that black and white book behind you? Is that Crowley? Who is that behind you on the shelf? Never mind. Maybe it's
I
not.
think I think that's the I think you're talking about the Secret Teachings of All Ages, the Manly P. Hall book.
Oh, okay. That's what I'm
Yeah.
saying. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, your screen is
Yeah.
really tiny. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's an excellent book. When God Had a Wife, I'm looking forward to reading it. I know that Robert Graves wrote a book called The White Goddess that I have never read, and I don't know anything about it, but a lot of people really, really point to that one as a good one for understanding a lot of this goddess culture from
Hmm.
prehistoric times.
Hmm.
But it is also very old, so I don't know how much the scholarship holds up. Um,
Well, Graves was quite the mythologist. I mean, he understood a lot of this material,
yeah.
and I know that's the beginning of a lot of this kind of material. But it does seem that there was this goddess worship, and as we said before, there were these quote unquote temple prostitutes. There was this kind of more it was the sexual rights and these things that went on in these ancient Near Eastern religions, and the as they were with most things, the ancient Israelites radically rejected all that.
Hmm. Yeah, they had to because the new the new laws they had. I mean, in some cases, you see it in the Bible in pretty clear writing where Asherah and her worshippers are driven out or just outright murdered. Um, Anyone who even so much as has one of the items of worship in their homes were driven out or killed. So that's a pretty good way to kill worship of someone, is to start murdering their worshipers. So it was I think in the esoterica video that I mentioned, he
Yeah.
goes into how the name Asherah and the names of a lot of these gods and goddesses that had been previously had been worshipped um, had like a suffix put onto their name, Ashtoreth instead of Asherah, and 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 so forth and so on, which meant shameful. And so all the things associated with them became shameful and dirty and unclean. And um, so even speaking about them was done in a very um, dirty kind of way, right?
We should say too that some of these, even though names, have even come down into like ritual magic. Like they don't
Mm.
even think about the roots of these things. A lot of that's even like the name Astaroth. That's her name in ritual magic.
Oh yeah. Oh man,
Yeah.
speaking of ritual magic, like it really makes you think about. I don't know how much you know about like Thelema, or I don't even know if I'm saying it right. I mean, I'm not a worshiper of, I'm not a believer in Thelema. I don't practice Thelema. There, that's the phrase I want. I'm not a practitioner of
Practitioner,
Thelema.
yeah.
Uh,
Neither
but
am I. I know. I
I
could
know a
really
lot
care
of it has
less,
to
but
do with like um, the Kabbalistic tree of life, and the idea of the Yod He Vahe, the Yahweh, as kind of like the groundwork for how the whole universe is formed. It really makes you think about a lot of that stuff, how these ideas are now being built off of systems that were brought in to replace goddess worshiping systems. I know old Uncle Al, Aleister Crowley, he kind of felt like, there was the aeon of the divine feminine, and then there was the aeon of the divine masculine, and now
Yeah.
we should be in the aeon of Horus.
Mm-hmm.
One wonders what comes after that. Maybe if I were a practitioner, I would know.
Just do what thou
Yeah.
will, and that's the whole thing.
Hmm?
Do what thou will, and that's the whole
Yeah, do
thing.
what I will.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is the whole of the thing.
I,
It's the
but
whole of the thing.
I'll be honest, and you and I've said this before to you, is that like Crowley was a real shit to women.
Yes, he was. He
Yes,
sure was.
his Babylons and his Scarlet women that he had in his life, that he one of that he left in India with his child, and how many other ones did he abuse?
You
Just
know,
I'm just putting that out there.
and it's interesting that you would put that out there today of all days. Today, here we are recording on the 21st of March,
Mm-hmm.
which is the New Year celebration, I think, of the equinox of the gods, I believe, and was the day that Rose Kelly, Crowley's partner at the time, or wife. I mean, I don't know if they were married yet or not. I don't know a lot of the history, but this is when she started channeling for
They were
for
on
the
their
for the
honeymoon.
law, right? Yeah,
Yeah, they
wasn't
were
it
on
the
their
book of the law
honeymoon.
that was written down? Yeah.
Yep.
So it wouldn't have happened without the Scarlet Woman, and that's today. So happy equinox, guys.
That's right. That's right. Well, it just kind of like to kind of wrap things up a little bit. Do we see the goddess religion? Do we see it coming back?
In a lot of ways, it didn't completely go away.
Mm-hmm.
It morphed into different ways of worshiping the feminine, and certainly there's a number of books that would support that claim, even within Christianity. I mean, doesn't that make you wonder about like Marian apparitions? Like, it makes me wonder about Marian apparitions.
Sure,
The
absolutely, it does.
Black Madonnas of like France in particular, but any kind of like the Celtic regions where the peoples moved from Anatolia farther west and took their black meteor stone goddess worshiping statues with them. And if the folklore is to be believed, when those places became heavily Christianized, and would not give up their statues and their items of worship, the Catholic Church said, okay, you can keep it, just put it in a dress and a crown. And she's Mary now. It makes you wonder about stuff like that. I think that there is obviously, I mean, anybody that's walked into a metaphysical shop would be blind to not see it, but there is quite clearly a resurgence of goddess worship, and certainly getting back to those roots. I mean, the Lord and Lady of Gardenian Wicca, another pal of old Uncle Al. That whole system of worship is based around kind of bringing back the goddess into worship, and then there's some forms of Wicca that only worship the lady, and not just with Wicca, but with lots of different resurgent pagan rites that people have kind of been able to find each other over the internet and kind of rebuild interest in those things. With the access to the literal entire world, we can kind of find each other and share our interests, and not just for hobbies, but or porn, but also for religious purposes. And so, um, I think that she's always been around, the goddess figure. she's always been around. She didn't go anywhere. She just took on different visages, and either because they were forced on her or because um, people decided to find her in those ways. I, you said that maybe we could that maybe we should get into this on the show, but like, I'm a Christian and I don't know what to do with this information. I don't know what to do with these histories about Yahweh and El syncretizing, and oh look, we found this extra writing about who God is, and now we can't worship God like this. It has to be like this. Like, what do I
Mm-hmm.
do with that? I
Mm-hmm.
don't know. I'm down with Jesus. Um, I definitely believe in the divine. I don't know how much stock I put in a modern interpretation of a literal translation of the Bible. I I don't know how I feel about that. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know what to do with
Yeah,
it.
it seems like that's for another show. And that's I think that, and actually, Zach Hunt has written a book kind of about that, about what is divine inspiration, what does
Oh,
that actually mean. So that might be something I might have him back in touch with him and get him on the show. But like he,
okay. When you do, get Dr. Future in on that. I want to talk to Dr. Future about all this stuff. I want to know what he thinks about this. Does he know about this? Please tell me, Dr. Future. What do I do with this?
you would really just have to ask him. I don't know how much. I mean, well, I've tried to kind of talk about some of the scholarship and some of this to him, and I mean, he'll give a whole really kind of different viewpoint. Mike tends to try to stay within the bounds of some orthodoxy, but
Yeah.
try to be more of a little more free thinking about it at the same time.
He has a good heart.
Yeah.
I don't always agree with him, obviously, like theologically, but he has a really good heart, and I'm always interested to hear what he has to say.
Yeah.
Um, but man, I'd love to pick his brain about this book. Like, I want him to like sit here, read this book. Now talk to me about it.
I don't know how hard it honestly is for me, because you're honestly bombarded by so many things from so many different sides. And I think it's okay for me to take the development of a religion and try to understand it. I don't think that that's really impossible. I mean, really, in the long run, I think it really helps you understand the contradictions that are within something like the Bible, which is not something that is homogenous, right? I mean, it's
Mm-mm.
several different books that are put together by several different people. And even within the first
Mm-mm.
5 books, they
Yeah.
think that there's like 4 or 5 different sources, historical,
Yeah. I mean, you got
that
histories and
over
letters
historical
and
time. Right.
poetry, and
Yeah.
I
So
mean, look, it doesn't even take a whole bunch of like extra biblical scholarship to look at the Bible and see in the beginning, clearly there was a worship of, there was an understanding that there were several gods. And
yeah.
then you see that evolve into, okay, there are several gods, but this is our one God that we're going to worship. And
Yeah.
then you see that evolve into, okay, there are several gods, and this is the one that we're going to worship, but also he happens to be the best one. And then you
Mm-hmm.
see that evolve into, not only is he the best one, but he's the only one. And like, you see this understanding of divinity evolve over time. And maybe some of that was forced onto these people by a different class of like priests or something. I don't know. But even if you don't want to look at all those extra biblical sources, you can see that evolution. And so to take to lift out a portion of the Bible and say, yes, this right here, this is theology, and the rest of it all agrees with this. Like, it doesn't. You can't do that. That's not how this works. This is a long book that is a history of the evolution of how we understand divinity. And I think that as a believer, I think that God is still trying to tell us how to understand divinity, whatever God is. I don't think it's just El. I don't think it's just Yahweh, but I think it's probably closest to Christ. Our understanding of who Christ was through the writings that still remain is probably the closest thing to God that we can understand. I mean, what do you do with all that? You just try your best to love people. and if you've got that part right, then you probably got the rest of it all right. And thank goodness, I don't think anybody has to have all their theology correct.
Yeah, that's true. Well, this has been a great conversation, Heather. I want to thank you for coming on to talk about When God Was a Woman. And are there any parting thoughts, or also tell people, I guess, where they can find you and anything else that you might want to just promote?
So I don't do a whole heck of a lot of anything other than raise a kid and sculpt miniatures for role-playing games. My husband and I are getting ready to try to release a Patreon in the next couple months for that. When I do, I'll be sure to throw it your way. Maybe I can pay you some money and you can put up a commercial for me. But it's Justice Games. We don't have a lot of presence on the internet yet. I think we have a very bare minimum Facebook page, but we're going to start releasing some miniature sculpts for that. But in regards to more Conspirinormal-esque kind of stuff, I do still give tarot readings. I've been at Conspirinormal's Strange Realities conference, and I do still give tarot readings if anyone is interested. That's at ask.shuffle.cut@gmail.com. And I'll be happy to do a reading for you. I got some prices that I can send you for that if you email me with a question. But yeah, that's and I'm on Facebook, but don't contact me there.
All right, awesome guy. Heather, you've been a really good supporter throughout the years. I really appreciate you coming on.
I love you, Adam. You're the best.
Love you as well. You guys, Surfiel is busy getting packed up to move to Seattle, and hopefully we'll get him back on here in a few weeks. But in the meantime, I hope you guys will enjoy the upcoming shows that we have. Just promotion, you guys, patreon.com/Conspirinormal. Come join the Ancient Order of Strange Realities and the Mystic Crew and all that. April 21st, we are going to be doing our first online meetup, this time with Travis Watson, and really curious to see what he's going to bring us. And to promote some other things, Strange Realities Conference, November 3rd through the 5th, 3rd and the 4th at SIR Nashville, the 5th online only. Come join us there. And don't forget to subscribe. It'll help us out just as well to Nevaeh's Nightmare on YouTube. If you don't know how to spell that, that's heaven spelled backwards, as in the Queen of Heaven. You see what I did there?
I see what you did there.
All right, cool. All right, guys, thanks for listening to Conspirinormal. And next week, I think we've got a guy come on to talk about how Jesus wasn't real. So I'm really going to off on that one. All right, guys, we'll talk to you soon.